What's the biggest story I can write? Anything is possible for the one who believes. Stories themselves have such power, and only fantasy fiction stories have limitless power. You can create any character you want to create, any world you want to create.
It's like you leaning right into a liturgy.
We are all religious.
Maybe this story has been twisted.
Every writer has the ability to pack messages into their story. Mm-hmm. And as you're writing, if you believe in absolute truth, which Christians do, your job as a storyteller is to lead people to that truth.
Hello, Reformed mythologist Nate Morgan-Locke here with a conversation with an author. The author's name is Benjamin George, and this is his book, Aquila. Benjamin, hello.
Hello, Nate.
In the back of the book, Benjamin, it says about the author, Benjamin George grew up in Bristol, UK, and is currently living there with his wife and son. Benjamin loves community, words, adventures, gardens, and cereal. So I was like, right, what's your favourite cereal?
Your question needs to be more specific, Nate, because are we talking about a brand of cereal or are we talking about a type of cereal?
Okay, what do
because
I mean?
Granola is undoubtedly the greatest type of cereal. I'd be happy to argue that with anyone.
Okay.
But once we start getting into brands, it gets more complicated.
Okay.
Clearly a man who is very serious about his cereal.
Have you written on cereal? Is there like a book?
I think I've only written, not a book, maybe one day. If I get a decent readership and they'll read anything I write, then that's when that needs to come out.
How much does cereal feature in the book as well? That's because I think that could be like your stock in trade, where people are like reading through the books and then they go, oh, did you get to the cereal bit in this one? It's like, oh, I missed it.
No, Meek creates very big, lovely breakfasts for everyone.
This is true.
She doesn't. There's no cereal. I think I need to bring cereal in, maybe in the sequel. In the sequel, there needs to be cereal, possibly. Yeah,
a cereal sequel.
And I need to build in a scene where the Aquila come down and eat the seeds of Refi's cereal, and he's very upset.
Yes, that would be
awesome.
Real. Now, tell me, Benjamin, what inspired you to become an author, not just of a single book, but as I look on the back of an entire trilogy, the Arkensia trilogy?
It's a good question. I think it definitely came about slowly for me. I have always loved writing, so I've been writing as a hobby since I was a teenager. And that just grew and grew. And then when I was in my 20s, I really felt that writing was a calling for me, that I was going to do it long term. Okay. I didn't think I was going to write a book at that stage. I definitely was thinking it was a career path, but also just a hobby on the side. I've always written prose and little poems and articles and things about theology, life, culture, those sorts of things. And then, I went on a big adventure in my 20s, several years in different places I went. And I decided at a certain point that the things I was learning needed to come out in a more structured way rather than just scattered over loads of different mini articles and mini stories. I needed to put it all into one place, and I thought that would be an enjoyable experience, but also definitely had a big thing I wanted to communicate to the world. And just over a series of events, realized that a fantasy fiction story was the way to communicate all of that, the best way to communicate all of that, excuse me. And I'd say once I'd realized that was the best way to communicate it, I was sold, and I had to get going with it, really. And the ideas came pretty fast once I decided, and that helped me know this is a life I want to live as an author. So, yeah. You
said you found fantasy was the right way of saying what you wanted to say. What fantasy had inspired you to even think that fantasy might be the best expression of these ideas?
Yeah, this might be a surprising answer, but it wasn't anyone else's story that inspired me necessarily to become a fantasy fiction author. It was more realizing that stories themselves had such power that and only fantasy fiction stories have limitless power, if you see what I mean.
Okay.
You can create any character you want to create, any world you want to create, and it's like a a world that can have as many meanings as you want it to. You can have as many layers as you want, and just coming to that realization, which definitely knowing that C.S. Lewis, such an inspirational man, had used fantasy fiction as a way of communicating his heart. You're thinking, okay, he's obviously onto something that's not random or unintentional that he chose that medium. And the same with other great thinkers using fiction and fantasy fiction. So, yeah.
Because Lewis has that great article, Why Fairy Stories May Say Best What's to Be Said. Have you read through that one?
No, but I definitely need to read that one.
It's where he uses the line, steal past watchful dragons. So the idea that a story, especially a fantasy story or a fairy story as he's using it, is a powerful thing because the vivid imagery and the fantastical allows people to suspend their disbelief in a way that allows different ideas to be presented.
Yeah.
So Lewis would be someone, and anyone else that was a particular formative influence on you, maybe growing up or in terms of becoming a writer?
Yeah, interestingly, George Muller has been a huge influence on my life. And he was not a fantasy fiction author, far from it.
No.
He wrote many journals of his faith life, and he famously established orphan homes that housed 10,000 orphans in his lifetime. And and it was all done by faith. He prayed in all the money and prayed in all the resources. His life was amazing. And he did all his work in Bristol, which is where I'm from.
Yeah.
And so I grew up with his story in my head, and what his story really communicated to me before I even had a strong faith of my own was that anything is possible for the one who believes. And this sort of the bigness of his life had a big impact on me. And I definitely have always been drawn towards big things. So in terms of stories, meta narratives or umbrellas that you can fit everything under, or trying to see the big picture all the time, bit of a big picture person. So George Muller's story, the bigness of it just inspired me a lot. And so when I was starting to write stories and things, it's, what's the biggest story I can write? I'm not just, I would find it too, just because of how I'm wired, I would find it too mundane or I guess boring to write about something very human and very everyday. And I'm glad writers are doing that. I don't want them to stop. It's just in terms of what I wanted to write. I wanted to write something huge, I suppose. Yeah. And people like George Muller and other faith heroes like that, that impacted me and ended up influencing my writing, even though it's indirect.
That is a surprising answer to that question. I was not expecting you to mention George Muller. That is fascinating. The sort of, I suppose, more theological or mythological ideas that you've got in the book. So the very fact that it is called Aquila, which I believe is the Latin word for eagle, and having these kind of angelic eagle beings. When did that sort of come to you? How did you sort of come across that as your kind of the theological structure or the mythological structure for the fantasy world?
I'm happy you've asked that, because that's actually the first thing that came to me about this story.
Okay.
And it came to me about 3 years before I started writing. So, how I mentioned I love to just write little things here and there and have many ideas sort of spread around journals and notebooks. One of these ideas was the beginning of a story of a young boy asking his grandfather about a letter he found that had written in it something about mythical birds and creatures that used to fly above the city. Okay. And that little tiny idea, I wrote that down, and it just stuck with me. I can't remember where it came from. It just something I jotted down. Came back to that 3 years later and felt that just the heart of that little note had in it everything I needed for a trilogy.
Okay.
So it was just like, the hook you can hang a million hats on. So I really just ran with it after that.
It is really cool, isn't it? Like, I was just thinking, so I live in Eastbourne now. In fact, Eleanor, you're in Eastbourne here 2. I should say hello, Eleanor. Welcome. I say welcome. Eleanor runs the show, so it's her world. We're just living in it. But living in Eastbourne, seagulls are obviously like a massive thing. And they are not birds that you think of as angels. They are birds you think of as demons. Like these, they are pretty, like, you've got to be careful with your chips on the beach. The idea that birds, like in scripture at least, in the way that even churches are designed and people have kind of used bird imagery, is like incredibly powerful. And maybe we can get into that, like the bird angel kind of connection, which seems to be pretty strong. Eleanor, you read Aquila and enjoyed it.
I did.
I believe so.
Did.
And what was your thought on this kind of angelic eagle mythos?
I really liked that there were the 7 different sort of purposes to each bird, and that they each had a purpose and a way that they interact with people.
Because they sort of have roles within
the
story.
And they are very epic creatures. Whenever one turns up, it's this big moment and everyone is awestruck whenever they turn up. And that is very angelic in a way of sort of whenever the angels turn up in the Bible, it's always do not be afraid.
Yeah, big deal. Yeah.
Yeah.
But like different types of birds communicate very different types of things. And obviously eagles communicate something of majesty and power and glory in a way that maybe the pigeon or the seagull doesn't quite do it. It's also a book which is about the elements, right? So water and potentially fire, and the fact there's birds kind of puts the air in there as well. But when did this kind of water aspect, or the kind of it's a very damp book in lots of ways. When did that come about?
Yeah, I think that was quite a natural part of the world building, really. So when obviously wanting to build a world that is appealing and sort of knowable to someone who's from planet Earth, but also different enough that it's stretching your mind and making you really imagine it because it's different to here. We all know water and are surrounded by it, but it doesn't permeate our daily life. You can live a dry life all year round if you really wanted to, because we tend to live in cities, in cars, in homes and offices. And so sort of bringing water to the forefront and making people have to travel by water, having just endless rain coming from the skies, and it just added that sort of tropical exotic nature to the planet. And I also, as soon as I thought that I might have the planet like that, storylines were popping up, and that's always a good idea. A good sign. If you have an idea and then suddenly you can imagine the story flowing from that, you should go with it, because it's obviously it's going to work.
Even the kind of the fact that how damp something is or how wet something is might be a significant feature of how the final tension is resolved. I thought that was like a really smart way of, it's not just a world that has a watery, wet vibe to it, but also that you've actually thought about how to put that into the actual resolution of the tension in the story. I thought that was great.
Thank you. Yeah, and I really wanted, it needed a narrative function, and it also sort of had one without me having to give it too much thought. It just sort of happened. Because it's hard not to give away too much, but it's there's definitely something about water that where we can't live underwater, so that's a very basic fact that limits storytelling. Because you want to do a scene underwater, well, there's only so long that person can go underwater. So anything that is underwater is hard to get, so therefore it might be very valuable because it's going to take someone going under there and holding their breath or figuring out a way to get under there without dying. And so I very easily, on a planet of water, found storylines where the characters are going to have to find what is most valuable in a place that is so deep. and that also has a strong link to baptism, because we go under the waters and we die down there, and it's a deep down dark place under the water, but there's that rising up out of the water and something changes in that process. So again, that all features in the storyline, because you've got that going down, which is very dangerous, but that sort of resurrection is coming, and that's a very biblical theme as well. So it all ties together.
I suppose what's so nice about fantasy, and as you said at the beginning, that because you've got all those different features which spur off other ideas and are connected to a whole kind of theology in our world, in the real world, that therefore you can just look at those in a fresh way when you just mix it up a little bit and have it on a new planet.
I really enjoyed your description of the performance that they do at the becoming ceremony that describes the creation myth that they're telling. And how that painted a very epic, mythic picture. And then the little hints throughout the book that maybe they haven't got that story right. Maybe this story has been twisted. I'd be very interested in the future books to find out what the true myth is.
Yeah. And this, you're touching on something really important from the book, which is that water, it has many functions in the narrative, but the sort of way that it's being put forward from the powers that be is that water is divine. So that's how they're telling the story of water. And they it doesn't take much to imagine how people could worship water, because it's, it covers so much of the planet, and we drink it and it gives us life. It's natural in a way for someone from a pagan background to worship water. And there's definitely this instinct on the planet to worship it because it's such a wet planet. And water is in everything they do and in their whole life. That has happened on the planet where it's become known as divine, and that's where the origin story of the planet it leans too far towards water. So the powers that be are using it, and they can use it for their own ends by telling the origin story in a clever way. That means they get to remain in power, and I'm unpacking that in the second book now, which I'm writing at the moment. Which I'm really excited to go into that, because the origin of this planet is much debated.
Yeah.
And, well, I say much debated. Certain people are having that debate, but a lot of people are saying case closed. We know how the planet came to be, which sometimes feels like our modern culture.
Right.
We don't need to really have that discussion in public square. Thank you very much. We know it evolved. Yeah, the Big Bang was a long, long time ago. You don't need to go there really too. But hang on. Have we twisted that origin story, and are there other explanations that describe how we got here better? So again, water's been really helpful telling that story as well.
Can I just say, I mean, that becoming ceremony, the idea that it's a coming of age, there's a significant ceremony that you must pass through in order to progress through in your life. It was great that you've got that in there, but also you've got the kind of ceremonies around death in there as well. I won't say whose death is being marked. Just thought that was a very interesting way of helping us see not just what the world is like, it's a wet, watery world, but also what the religion of the people is, what the folk religion is. And I'll just read this little bit from your own book to you, if you don't mind. We have lost him from the world, we have lost him from our lives, but we have lost him to the water, and his memory will never die. We have lost him from the world, we've lost him from our lives, we have lost him to the water, the place where all memories lie. What made you think you wanted to go into a kind of religious aspect of this character dying, rather than just sort of say that people just dealt with it, or were surprised, shocked and saddened? It's like you leaning right into a liturgy, really, straight away. Yeah. What inspired that?
I guess the first thing that inspired that is that we are all religious. I'm not having it from the new atheists that we can choose to be unreligious if we so please. Yeah. It's a lie. I think something has to take our top spot, doesn't it? Which some people have helped me understand. And people on another planet, it would be no different if there was another race that was a predominant race on a planet and they were building civilization and culture. They would have each person would have a top spot, and that culture would have a top spot. And if it's not taken by a personal god, like the Christian God, it might be taken by an element like water, or it might be taken by a certain person. The king of the land might rise up and be, they're actually our divine king. They're more than just a human king. We cannot help ourselves because of how we're made, and I would say how we're made by a creator, to put him in top spot.
Yeah.
And so I'm building a world with a different type of humanity, but they're still going to follow the patterns of our humanity, because how can intelligent beings with free will not have a first priority, which effectively means you're building a sort of religious structure where you aim towards the highest thing, and you worship it, sometimes through liturgy and other sort of rituals, or you might worship it just because you live for it, which is very similar. Worship is both of those things, isn't it? So does that answer the question?
Yeah, no, definitely. The idea that human beings are intrinsically religious. Tell me a bit more about your journey to faith.
Yeah, so I was raised in a Christian home by very loving parents who faithfully took me to church and tried to instill in me the core message of the faith, and I really was happy with that for a long time. I say a long time, until my teens, where I sort of revisited the big questions that people were saying against my faith, and they rocked my faith, to be honest. At that stage, I was, I think, 14, 15 when the questions really just overwhelmed me. The big ones: how can a good God exist when there's so much evil and suffering in the world? That was a major one for me, that just, as I started delving into that, my faith was really derailed. And so for a few years I felt that there weren't any really satisfying answers to those questions, so I was sort of in a bit of a wilderness. And then when I was about 19, 20, I had some good experiences in my life that opened my eyes a bit more, and I realised I needed to explore this thing again thoroughly and make my own choices rather than just float through life. I thought, I'm going to be intentional here and try and search for this God if he is out there. And if he's not, I'm going to sort of put that to bed and live my best life that's not faith based. So I did, the classic reading for and against God's existence, which only certain people do. So I read books by some people that had gone before me, and it was really helpful, really, really helpful. And after, I sort of was getting through these books very quickly, and saw that actually the Christian worldview was very coherent, so more coherent than I ever realised, even growing up. It was, oh wow, I'm starting to, you're chipping away at something, and you hit, I don't know, gold behind the sort of rough, and you think, this is absolutely solid, this thing. I'm sort of trying to knock it down with arguments, and I cannot knock it down. So seeing the strength of the worldview was huge. And then I needed the relational element, where I sort of got to know God on a personal level, and that came a bit later. And then it did come. I felt that God was sort of responding to my prayers through his answers in my life, and just decided that the evidence was overwhelming and that I was being called into relationship, and then it was go from there on, really.
And so in terms of becoming a Christian, it was having some questions, but then finding that there were coherent answers. Then the relationship grows. What is it then? What's keeping you a Christian today? What keeps you a Christian?
Well, that's such a good question. Away from all the sort of emotional stuff, because there are those sorts of answers, personal and emotional answers. I think the foundational answer is, I think the Christian story is true. On every level, factually true, historically true. On a narrative level, it's got truth all through it. It's so true that if I gave up my faith and let's say I have a huge wobble, I feel that I would still know that it's true, and I would almost just be running from what I know to be true. So I've just sort of hit that point where, where the disciples say to Jesus, don't they, you have the words of eternal life, where else would we go?
Yeah.
And at times where I may not be feeling sort of, in love with God and pursuing him with all my passion, I still have that thing in the bottom of me that just says, where else would I go? Because you sort of found what's true, and that's it. So that keeps me going through. all sorts
I can
of stuff.
see that really clear, like that really clearly in the book, actually.
Yeah.
Just definitely Clay and Refi. They both have to have this acceptance that this other world or sort of other idea of the world is true, and they go through all of these obstacles, and they definitely have their doubts of, oh, maybe I should give up, maybe I should go back, but there's always this underlying no, I've discovered that there's truth out there, and I need to find that truth, and I need to stick to that truth. I definitely see that in those two characters and the journey they go on.
And this is interesting because some things you write, you don't consciously write them or intentionally write them. So you've seen something that links to my story, but I didn't do that intentionally necessarily. I'm just exploring these characters and trying to send them where they would go in reality. And sort of you accidentally put your life in there, don't you? Sometimes consciously, but sometimes not.
Yeah. And so as a Christian writer, do you think, are there areas that you wouldn't go into? Are there things topics and ideas that you don't think you would ever tackle?
That's a good question as well. I don't know if anything's off limits, but there are certain things I would handle very carefully, or maybe just... And again, this is the thing with fantasy fiction. You can address things in different ways. You don't have to tackle... And actually, throughout the book, I don't tackle the topic of faith head on. I wouldn't say that. I've had people read the book that they can't even see where the biblical references are. They don't know. They've heard I'm a Christian, they've read the book, and they're sort of thinking, oh, it just was a nice story, like an exciting story. I didn't necessarily see the faith element. So I do love tackling topics not head on, and I think actually Jesus does that. Not all the time. Sometimes he's very direct and head on, but sometimes he'll tell a parable and everyone's sort of scratching their heads and wondering, what's he really trying to say here? And it might even take months before they get to the bottom of the story. And again, it's the C.S. Lewis thing of, this is the best way to tackle the big issues, is through stories. And so I feel I could maybe have a go at any topic, but you do have to pick your battles there. You can't try and address every issue. So.
And I like that as an idea, that it's not as though Christian writers avoid certain topics and content. It's that because they're Christians, they address those topics from a particular perspective with the confidence that the gospel is true, that God is good, and that they're a sub-creator underneath.
I found it quite refreshing to read a new fantasy novel that's come out that isn't obsessed with violence and sex, because I feel like that's the huge trend in fantasy at the moment, especially all of the TikTok books that people are raving about. And it's just really refreshing to read a fantasy book where someone's put a lot of care into the world that they've created.
Do you think, Benjamin, that is there something about being a Christian that means you write fantasy in a deeper way? It's not just an excuse to explore more about individual expressive idealism.
I think there's an element of truth in that, definitely. I suppose the way I'd explain it is every writer has the ability to tell a story, to pack messages into their story. And as you're writing, if you feel that if you believe in absolute truth, which Christians do, your job as a storyteller is to lead people to that truth. And if your story is messing with people, discouraging them, sending them off track, with any scene that you paint, you're getting it wrong. And so there's definitely a seriousness to the task as a Christian, which is, one day I have to answer to God, and he might say to me, why did you include that scene in the end of that book? Because that misled thousands of people. If I ever get a big readership. There's a real weightiness to that. And so I do take it seriously. Even the smaller part, even tiny details, I'm not saying I let it inhibit me. And it's not like the story takes 10 times longer because I'm stressing over details. It just means as I'm going, I've just got the filter on, is this encouraging? Is it good? Does it guide people to the truth? Is it wholesome? And if there are scenes of violence, which there are a few, and there will be more, and if there are scenes of romance, which there will be more of, am I telling it in a way that... Because the thing is, a 15-year-old might pick up my book. A 12-year-old might pick up my book, and I am accountable for what they read in my story. I have, if a parent of a 12-year-old came to me and said, right, they've just read your book and now they're starting to get involved in this, or now they're starting to believe this sort of wacky thing, I have to answer that parent and be able to face the music. And I write with that awareness, definitely.
Now being on the second book, has the experience of writing the first one changed the way you think about writing?
Yeah, it does change how you think about things. It's a massive project doing it. It's 110,000 words, the first book.
Wow.
And anyone who's written that much on either on one topic or one story will tell you it's quite a formative experience. It's sort of you have to go quite deep to finish it, definitely. And before I start the second one, I was much more aware that this is a huge undertaking. It's going to take a lot from me, a lot of commitment, consistency, dedication, sort of. And also you need like constant inspiration to write each chapter if you want to write a good book anyway. It needs to be full of interesting moments, full of incredible storylines and things. And it all needs to work together to the end. And so I knew how big it was going to be. The first time you write a book, you just go in blind. You think this is going to be fun, and you have no idea how hard it is.
And do you think? Because it's just as you say, it's such a huge undertaking to write 100,000 words on anything. Even just getting through the publication process and making sure that you've actually got a physical copy of a book, with a cover on it. That's a lot of work and a lot of perseverance needed to get through those kind of obstacles and trials. What's kept you going in that writing process? Yeah, as you're facing the current struggles of writing, the second of a trilogy, you really committed yourself, didn't you, by saying it's a trilogy from the outset? What's helping you get through those kind of writer's block, or just the grind of publishing a book?
The first thing is a faith thing. Again, it's because at the beginning I felt that God was sort of blessing it and saying, this is what I want you to do with your life. There are other things I'm also called to do, but that was one of the major ones. So, I wrote trilogy on... I always felt it was a trilogy. I've stamped that on the first book. It's going to be a trilogy. And that's, you sort of... Sometimes giving yourself a goal is what helps you achieve something, isn't it? If you just sort of leave it open-ended, you might wander.
Yeah.
But telling myself... And one thing is like having an idea of a release date for the book, or having an idea of I want to do this for the release party, or, it's just things in the future that you're thinking, people have read this book and I want them to have the second book in their hands in 2025. And if they don't, it's going to be sad. It's going to be sad for me. They're not going to know what happens in the story. The momentum of the project will slow down. It's all these things of motivation, really, as well.
I love the cover. I must say, people might be able to see that I've sort of got a similar... Tried to match the Speak Life cup to the cover. But I'm sure, although I haven't asked her, Eleanor will know what it is about the cover that I love so much. So let's see if she knows. Without me telling you, what is it about this cover that I enjoy?
It's a Rukan figure.
It's a Rukan figure. Perfect. Do you know what a Rukan figure is, Benjamin?
Yeah, I do, yeah.
Go on.
Just about. It's a symbolic figure that cropped up a long, long time ago, where you have a very small figure looking out into the vast unknown. That's
beautiful. No, that's perfect. So just here, we've got... is that clay? Who do we think that is? So. Refi?
It is clay.
Okay.
Although I had to sort of play on this. It is a scene in the book.
Okay, so it is a scene in the book. But just...
A little bit,
yeah, so the Rukan figure looking out into... It's a heroic position, really. It's a heroic composition that there's the hero in the kind of looking out over the lands, off on their adventure. And yes, I mean, that looks like quite a challenging adventure. And the other thing that's really great about it on this cover is how many waterfalls there are. I'm assuming that was part of your direction to the artist, whose name is Lucy, was it? Yes,
yeah,
Lucy.
She's called Lucy Schneider, good friend of ours. Yeah. She, funny enough, after I saw the first draft, my wife and I both thought it was perfect. Well, very nearly perfect.
Okay.
We just wanted more water, so we asked for more waterfalls to expand a couple of the lakes and things, just to make it clear what this planet is like. So
more water. Very good. And then having that wonderful wing across the top as well. It's really cool as well. What's your sort of hope with the book, or with your writing in general?
I do have big ambitions and dreams, and I think most writers do. Most writers would love to be internationally recognised, well, internationally read. The recognition doesn't matter really. I would love the book to be in many, many hands.
Yeah.
And I would love the whole trilogy to make its way out into the world and make an impact on people's lives, really. That's the ultimate goal. Like I said earlier, the goal of writing for a Christian is to help lead people to the truth of the Trinitarian God and his goodness and what he wants for us and why he created the world and what is in store for those who persist in their faith, persevere in their faith, I should say. And that's what I want to do with these books. And if that happens with a few people, I need to be content and say, thank you, God, that it touched a few people's hearts. I would love it to touch many more people's hearts, but we'll have to see what God has in store and whether we can sort of market it well as well. So,
well, we're very grateful here at Reformed Mythologist Towers in the great city of Speak Life that you've taken all that trouble to write all those words, and that you're continuing to write the second one. Benjamin, how can people keep up to date with you and what you're doing?
Sure. So my website is benjamingeorgebooks.com. Benjamin George, my author name, books with an S.com. On there you can sign up to our newsletter, which is, we do not bombard anyone. It's just once a month or sometimes even less, and it just gives you a little roundup. How am I getting on with the second book? Here, we've got a blog on the website as well, and I'll let you know every time a new blog post comes out, which tends to be once a month. And we've also got Instagram, which is the same handle, so it's at Benjamin George Books.
Okay.
So yeah, it would be great to hear from anyone. If anyone wants to order a copy, it's £12 for a hard copy. You can order that through my website. If you're an ebook sort of person, it is on Amazon for my sins. £3 for the ebook on there. So yeah.
And are you thinking of doing an audio book? And if you are, who would be your dream reader? Or do you want
you,
to
Nate?
Oh wow.
No, I have a
you
friend.
You might need to help me with some of the pronunciation,
much...
because as I say, I called it Arquenzia, but it's Arquenzia. So yeah, I need it all spelt out phonetically. That's the thing.
Yeah, I have a friend who really wants me to release an audiobook, and he said he won't read the book physically because he only listens to audiobooks, which is quite annoying. And so it's on my mind, but there's many things we have to do first. I want to get the trilogy written before.
Okay, let's get all three in the trilogy done before we turn them into an audiobook. Well, great, Benjamin. It's really, really good to chat to you, and thank you again for joining us to have a chat about that. And Christian writing, Christian publishing, all of that sort of stuff is endlessly fascinating. Thank you very much, Eleanor.
Thank you for letting me join the conversation. It's been really interesting to hear from you.
And thank you, Benjamin, for being here with us.
Thanks for having me on, guys. It's been really good.
Very good. I'm Reformed Mythologist Nate Morgan-Locke. I'm glad you were here.